After Hush was hired by Vanguard, my job got so much better. Sure, my budget was slashed and my resources were reduced, but I got to spend time with Hush. We spoke as we converted Fort Zipacna into something livable for her. Fort Zipacna was once a storage site for airplanes, and the ceiling was high enough for Hush to stand comfortably. She stood at 24.4 meters tall, so most buildings she would never be able to stand in. Clearing out most of the engineering equipment was easy. Getting things put in was a much more difficult job. I think nearly a third of my time was just in meetings about budgets and construction. The marshal fought me nearly every step of the way. The marshal was an older black woman who looked like she worked in a library instead of as the head of emergency services in Isle City. But she was strict with her budget, and every request I sent her was initially denied, and I had to appeal every single request, no matter how small or how important. Why would we approve a 50,000 aura budget for the construction of a restroom? She said, barely glancing at my notes that explained the why of the budget. She just looked at the cost and then said it was too much. The idea of comparing costs to alternatives or even understanding what would happen if it wasn't paid for never occurred to her. So I decided to be blunt since she wasn't reading over my form. Because Hush needs a functioning shower and toilet. She cannot exactly fit in a public restroom, and she has the same hygiene needs as human beings. So if she doesn't have a functioning shower or toilet, what do you intend she do? I asked the marshal, whose eyes grew wide for a second, but then looked down at the number again. But the cost? Fine. It'll be approved. Construction begins today. She agreed, and we moved on with the meeting. The contract with the marshal and with Isle City dictated that they would take care of her basic needs and pay her for her services rendered. What I never intended to fight them on was the definition of what was or wasn't a basic need. Imagine standing in front of a public town hall in front of numerous citizens and 13 viscounts and telling them to their face that refusing to fund the clothing budget for their newest superhero would result in her not having any clothes at all. Then imagine that council asking for proof to justify that not having money for specially made clothes would result in her not having clothes. This side of the political game was a lot harder than the one I was playing for years. That side was simple. Tell your Viscount how they were to vote, send a bribe to another, promise to vote for a proposal to someone else, and cash in a favor for yet another. But here, I had to play by the written rules. So, it was a lot of work and a lot of patience. But thankfully for a Hush and my own sanity, I still had my secrets. A little blackmail goes a long way, especially if you stay anonymous. Then you can wait and use the same threat again later. The trick is not to use the same threat too closely and to use something that is recent enough to be scandalous, not so recent that they may spin it in a different way. The royal family had a lot of secrets. Even lowly viscounts were no different. Every one of them had a different level of what was or wasn't too scandalous for them. One viscount may cave with a single picture taken of them at the water park because they didn't want people to know that they were spending time in a water park. Another viscount wanted her sex parties hidden because she had a public persona of being one of the main supporters of the anti-sex league. Then you very carefully tailor the blackmail to them. A quick email from the shadow web to a personal email that the Viscount thinks is private, but is actually extremely easy to find. And then suddenly approval for Hush's new wardrobe, bed, board, stipend, and an expense report were approved with minimal grumbling. Although obtaining the funding and support was difficult as it was a lot easier on me than what I had to do for the academy. Sure, politics are difficult, but I knew it was for the right reasons. What I did for Agamemnon was physically easy, but it weighed heavily on my heart. We discussed it many times in class, and logically, it all made sense. A new hero, a possible threat, or ally. First thing you did was learn about them. Learn everything you can and process that information and give it back to my superiors in the academy, including Admin Agamemnon himself. It was so easy to tell Hush we had to run tests to figure out her abilities. She agreed wholeheartedly, and I just had to make another call to another ally of the academy. Technitius was a master of both nanotechnology and gigatechnology. So he would design and work with computers the size of molecules and machines the size of individual cells, allowing him to build amazing spy technology that could be snuck in anywhere on a single centi. However, it was his gigatechnology that was what I needed. Gigatechnology was the exact opposite of nanotechnology. Machines and electronics built to still be functional even on a much larger scale. You see it all the time in industrial settings, such as ovens designed to heat up hundreds of thousands of pounds of food evenly, desalinization machines designed to turn seawater potable for an entire city, or scales that had to be accurate to the gram, but also large enough to measure full oil tankers. So, we would have to take all of Hush's tests on Technitius's personal lab in the abandoned Rose District. After the arrangements were made our way over there, I was escorted in one of the Vanguard's killer pillars with about half a dozen support staff or rangers, while Hush took what was supposed to be the longer way, walking. The killer pillar left first while the streets were cleared for Hush's walking path. Fort Zipacna's drawbridge was lowered, and the streets from our district were cleared so we could reach the Rose District. Just over a third of the districts in Isle City were abandoned. There used to be 21 districts with 21 viscounts. There were now 13, with my former boss replaced by his son in no time. The districts were abandoned when they were considered too difficult to protect from the ocean, or if the majority of the viscounts decided to remove government from a specific district to get back at a specific viscount. So, when that happened, the city council officially announced that there was no longer a government in the abandoned district, and the residents were given a week to leave, or else they would be considered lost forever. Most residents evacuate when given a week, but some choose to stay. Some abandoned districts weren't too bad. They still had utilities, free of dangerous kaiju. They just lacked a formal government, but everyone was still friendly, if a bit isolated. And then there were districts that a zombie apocalypse would actually be an improvement. The people who lived in those districts didn't do so for very long. Rose District was somewhere between those two. Technitius had a complex in the Rose District when the city council voted it to be abandoned to get back at the Viscount who approved Technitius having a complex built there. They figured it would drive him away from Isle City and into a different city. The only thing it did was cut them off from a new source of taxes and give Technitius a place where he could do his work without any government interference. So, within the complex, the Rose District was quite nice for everyone who lived and worked there. There was power, water, internet, food, and safe places to sleep. A pleasant little corporatocracy. You work, you get a place to live, as long as you keep working and never insult your boss. Just outside the walls of the compound, it was a ghost town. No residents remained outside the compound very long, for reasons no one survived long enough to share. Although I suspected the reason why the district was empty probably had to do with Technitius's never-ending test subject. This was where we had to do Hush's tests. When we crossed into the Rose District, there was a very clear contrast. For the 3 blocks leading up to the Rose District, there were warning signs everywhere, warning where we were going. Warning, Rose District ahead. Warning, District abandoned. And finally, the sign on the chain link fence separating both the districts. Unlike the professional signs, this one was spray painted on a corrugated steel plate and bolted to the fence. But still, the warning felt very serious despite its unprofessional nature. This town will take everything you have and make you feel guilty about it all. Leave ASAP. When we made it to the fence, one of the rangers left to unlock the fence and open it. It creaked open, and the killer pillar drove forward only to stop for the fence to be locked. We drove forward another 3 blocks before we came across another fence. This one wasn't chain link, but reinforced steel that was 5 meters tall, with no sign on it. This gate took longer to open, and when it opened, it was without a creak, as we finally drove into the Rose District proper. Dual fences were used to keep anyone from getting too close to anything dangerous, and to keep anything dangerous from getting too close to getting out. It wasn't like the movies, with a single fence containing everything. The Rose District looked like every other abandoned district I saw before. Stagnant seawater that was a few centimeters deep covered the road. Trash was scattered everywhere. Plants were overgrown, and the concrete was starting to chip and crack. The buildings were still standing, and oddly enough, the glass was still whole. Cloudy, but whole. Most of the time when a district was abandoned, there were looters or vandals. But apparently, when the Rose District was abandoned, there was enough time for looting or vandalism. Very strange indeed. As we made our way towards the compound, I felt a distant boom before I heard it, and it got closer and closer. As it got closer, I watched the Vanguard with me start to worry. Was it an earthquake? A kaiju stomping towards us? The Keeper of the Deep? But as it came from where we came from, my heart slowed as I shouted to everyone. It's okay, everyone. Our hero is here. Just as Hush jumped over the fence and made her way to the compound. I had seen Hush many times by that point, but this was the first time I saw her running. She looked so free and in so much joy. The world couldn't hold her down, and I knew that if she could, she would run for hours to keep the feeling this way, if she could. My analytical mind noted that she was running quicker than 343 meters per second, so she was definitely outrunning the speed of sound. So that would need to be countered if we were going to take her down. That thought felt so sinister, like an illness I had lived with my entire life had reminded me that it was still there when I just wanted to look over her. I almost had to tell that part of myself to shut up while I watched Hush run to the compound in the distance. Even in the distance, I could see Hush was still smiling, and she waved to us as we made our way to Technitius's compound. As we drove, the man next to me let out a strange laugh. So, do you think she's single? She, a- he asked me, probably assuming I was one of his people. Unfortunately, he was going to get a very quick lesson. She isn't, and she doesn't go for men, I answered simply, and he sputtered as he backtracked, trying to sound less weird. Hey, I was just asking a question. I'm sure it's completely normal to wonder, right? He said. I'm pretty sure to do what you are wondering would be painfully lethal to you and completely pleasureless to her. If I were you, I would focus on your job and leave your wondering about keto class heroines to your off duty hours like a sane person. I told him as I took a few notes in my notebook. What the fuck does that mean? He asked, clearly confused. So I decided to spell it out for him. Have you ever been slapped by a woman because you kept making advances, even though she said no? I asked him, and I could tell by the blush on his face that had happened. Well, imagine being slapped by someone who can literally hit like a freight train. I warned him, and judging by the way he turned pale, he finally got it. I turned back to my notes, trying to get my mind away from a ranger's fantasies about my friend, before he decided to just make that impossible. Stupid bitch. At that point, I wasn't going to let it go. I was willing to let it go without repercussions before, but at that point, he needed a true lesson. He knew I could hear him, but no one else could. So if I called him out, he could argue I was trying to cause a fight. After all, he was an experienced Vanguard Ranger, and I was a brand new liaison. If we both went to the marshal, whose word would be believed? So, if I was going to get revenge, I was going to have to do it in a way where he couldn't tell anyone else, but where he unquestionably knew it was me. I let that simmer in the back of my mind as we pulled up to the compound. The gates opened and we pulled into the compound. It resembled a tech campus from somewhere like the Triple Alliance. Pure white buildings, sidewalks, trees, carefully cut just so, and people looking relaxed and calm. Keyword looking. I could tell from a glance that everyone was stressed out of their minds, but trying to distract themselves from it. A level of stress I was familiar with for those who worked with Technitius. He was a brilliant man, but he had no tolerance for anyone who slowed him down or who struggled with what he had to teach. He was incredibly impatient, and the idea of repetitive research and publication was beneath his interests. Even in the Mad Scientists Union, an organization not exactly well known for high standards of ethical practices, considered Technitius a rogue scientist. He wouldn't be allowed to work for them, so he found employment at Agamemnon's. And even as a rogue scientist who was banned from working with other mad scientists, he still found contract work with the Seven Cities. We got set up in a warehouse on the campus, which was, thankfully, large enough for Hush to stand. We could see some of the large equipment set up, some of which I could recognize. A large at the large scale. A Newton's punching bag, treadmill, and others I couldn't recognize nearly as much, such as a large archway full of satellite dishes, needles, and arms. Maybe a medical device of some kind? That was certainly odd. Hush didn't seem nervous at all. She seemed excited, almost bouncing from leg to leg as the last touches were made, and Technitius made an appearance. He didn't appear in person, of course, but his voice crackled through the speakers and a projector lit up, showing us a still image of Technitius's face. He had pale skin, blue sunglasses, and messy brown hair that almost reached his ears. In all of my years, I never met him in person, but I was certain he did exist. The persona he gave off was too ridiculous to be anything but real. "Welcome, everyone. This is my lab," he said before the image flickered, showing us a picture of a Labrador retriever with a large branch in his mouth. That brought a laugh to everyone, myself included. He made this joke often, but it was a lot better than letting him get impatient with us. "And this is my laboratory," he said, lights coming on and showing all of the equipment around us. "Now, these tests are to give us a better idea of what to expect with your abilities. So far, the only thing we know about you, Hush, is that you're big. But even with that information, there's still a lot of things we don't know that may prove helpful. For example, why are you so light?" "Well, I work out a lot," Hush said. After a moment, there was a laugh in the group as Technitius explained. "Not quite what I meant. According to the square cube law, you should be quite a bit heavier than you are, but you're not. So your anatomy may not be strictly human. And honestly, I'm not even sure if it's anthropomorphic. But that's what these tests are for. So your first task is to drink the water in front of you." A spotlight lit up, showing a large barrel of water. Sure enough, Hush grabbed the barrel and drank it quickly. "What is this going to prove? How quickly can I metabolize water?" she asked, and I felt a shiver run up my spine. I didn't know how he was going to react to being interrupted again. Thankfully, he seemed to be in a good mood. "No, we are tracking things like your heart rate and other functions using nanomachines inside the water. It will communicate with each device so we can get an idea of where you are physically fit, and of course how to scale it to our size. You're clearly stronger than a normal person, but the question remains, are you just strong compared to a Typicam, or would you still be strong at your old size? How much of a threat are you?" he meant. That was the purpose of these tests. How powerful was she, and were there any weaknesses that could be exploited? Most strengths had a weakness built right in. Most exami that had super strength usually had less endurance. Those who could heal quickly had to consume a lot to keep healing, and those who were super durable usually overheated easily. That being all said, there were enough unknowns with Hush. These tests were needed. So first, I want you on the treadmill. Start at a walk and gradually increase your speed until you reach your top speed. Both May and I will be keeping track of your heart rate whenever you're ready," he said as she flashed me a thumbs up and got onto the large treadmill, while I checked my own tablet. Her statistics were visible to me on the tablet. Her heart rate was an extremely low 18 beats per minute at rest, as she started to walk and then gradually jog on the treadmill. For typical humans, the resting heart rate was usually 60 beats per minute. Her heart rate would be lethally slow if she was a typicam, but her heart rate did make sense for a creature of her size. Blue whales were a similar size, and their heart rate ranged from 2 beats per minute to 33 beats per minute. A larger heart could pump more blood all at once, but the blood also needed more time to reach the muscles and organs. It was part of the reason why creatures like mice and hummingbirds had such high heart rates, while megafauna like elephants and rhinos had such slow heart rates. As I watched Hush's speed increase without her heart rate even ticking up, I noticed something odd about the warehouse. All of the doors were shut, and the staff that were bustling around were now mysteriously absent. And I noticed a headache I was having. It was just enough to know it was there, but not enough to say anything. Now my paranoia was in full swing. I looked at the rangers. All of them looked sleepy, and despite not doing much, they were all exhausted and sitting on some chairs. With that, my suspicion was confirmed as I quickly lifted my shirt to cover my face as I held it close. It wouldn't do a lot, but with some focus and the impromptu mask, I might be able to last a few minutes. This wasn't what I thought it was. Most standard procedures about new assets were to examine them and figure out if they were worth controlling or destroying. I figured that was what this was, especially since that was what I was told. But now I knew Hush was too much of a risk. She wasn't even worth assessing. She was only worth destroying. Everything fits now. Have someone entrusted to bring her to an isolated location and put her in a situation where she would be distracted and vulnerable. They didn't know about any real weaknesses, so a bullet or poison via injection were not viable. At her size, they couldn't really poison her with the drink. Radiation was a big unknown that would likely make her more dangerous. However, she does breathe, and if they put her in a situation where she breathes heavily, and where she is likely to ignore the symptoms of the poisonous gas until it was too late for her to do anything, well, then they might have her. As for the Rangers and I, we were just collateral damage. That hurt me even more than the idea of them hurting Hush. I served the Academy loyally for years. I did everything right. I was one of the best possible students who brought in so much money, and I did so much good for Agamemnon. And when they had the chance to hurt a threat, they didn't even try to get me out of danger. They were willing to sacrifice me without any hesitation. I was Iphengia to them. In that moment, with the gas starting to collect on the bottom of my lungs, I looked at that story from a different perspective. We were told that Agamemnon was justified. If he wasn't willing to sacrifice his own daughter, then he wouldn't be worthy of the prize of destroying Troy. But how did it look from Iphengia's position? She is watching her father try to capture her aunt. She watches her dad make questionable choices, sacrificing his own soldiers, burning villages, and torturing enemies. But she tells herself that it's all justified. She loves and she trusts her father, so everything was going to be all right. After all, he still loved her, and he would never hurt her nor let anyone hurt her. But one night he tells you he needs something from you. You get worried, but you tell yourself you trust him. You tell yourself you're going to be okay. He lies to you and tells you that you are going to be okay. Even as he ties you to the stake and lies the wood around your feet. You ignore the evidence in front of you. You try and tell yourself that it cannot be what it looks like. He loves you. He would never hurt you. You sacrificed for him. You believed in him. You supported him when no one else did. Surely your father would never sacrifice you. You tell yourself that, even as the smoke makes your eyes water. You tell yourself it has to be a test, as the flames lick your feet. You tell yourself that it isn't what it looks like, even as your eyes close for the last time, and you convince yourself that the man who is burning you alive, get a better wind, loves you as much as you love him. He will tell himself it was worth it. He will tell himself it hurt him, but he's still around and he wins. So it's his tragedy. Ignoring that from your perspective, it isn't a tragedy. It's murder. The people I trusted were about to murder me to get to Hush. In that moment, the part of me that had been pushed around ever since Aurora moved into my life didn't bend. It didn't move. It pushed back. This situation I was in was impossible. And if it was an impossible situation, then I was going to find an impossible solution. I decided no more. I had given away piece after piece of myself, but at that moment I decided no more. No more of myself was going to be given away. Hush, we need to leave now. There's poison in the air, I called out, and she paused on the treadmill, only to sway for a moment, recognition hitting her eyes. It was something I loved about her. She had such a curious mind, but when danger occurred, she never reacted, she acted. Immediately, she ran to the massive doors we came in through, and she ran into them, leading with her shoulder. There was the sound of her hitting metal, but the door didn't budge. Oh, Adansi, it was too much for her to move. She weighed as much as a whale, and she stood taller than most buildings in Isle City. And she still wasn't strong enough to move these doors. I felt a creep of panic creep into me. If Hush wasn't strong enough, then what were we going to do? While that dark thought crept through my mind, something unexpected happened. Hush punched the door, and when that didn't work, she punched it again. It barely dented the metal, her knuckles split, and I could see blood fall, and still she hit the door as hard as she could. Here she was, in a situation she couldn't possibly win, and she still wasn't giving up. It didn't seem like she was bothered at all. She just struck the door as hard as she could to get it open, and when that failed, she just hit it harder. That curious personality quirk of hers, the determination to keep going no matter what, a trait we only discussed in the academy as a trait to exploit, never as a trait to possess. But in that moment, with poison in my throat and hopelessness in my heart, I wanted her determination. So I decided I would borrow hers. If Hush wasn't going to give up, neither was I. There was no point in keeping it a secret anymore. If I was going to live, both Hush and Agamemnon would learn my secret. But if that secret lets me live, then so be it. I removed the Rethan device from my pocket. It had been nearly 10 years since I used it, but it was as polished as ever. I selected my size to maximum and pressed the button. Even with the poison slowing my mind and muscles, I could feel the power of the device flow through me. Every cell charged, like I just finished a refreshing bout of exercise, and I just drank refreshing water. I forgot how good this power felt, and for a moment I wondered why I ever let that feeling go. Now at my full size, I was still a head shorter than Hush, but I still stood tall, and I planted my feet, and I pressed my hand against the door as I pushed as hard as I could. For a moment, Hush looked confused, then accepted what she saw. I loved that about her. As I pressed against the steel doors with all my weight and my feet braced against the door, as the doors creaked against my body weight. Hush was strong, but she was a lot lighter than I was. Physics dictated the energy would be the mass of an object times the force squared. So if I added my weight to Hush's force, maybe Hush punched at the same spot. This time the door finally cracked open and we both pushed them open as fresh air filled the warehouse. We both took gulping breaths for almost a minute before Hush finally glanced my way and asked, I love the look. Are you thinking about making this a regular thing? She teased, and I laughed before I finally stood back straight. Away from the poison air, the Rangers were starting to stir, but they were still passed out. They would need a hospital quickly. I can explain, but for now let's get them to St. Peter's, as I told her as I quickly set my size back to normal. I would have a long explanation for Hush later.